Hello and welcome to week 6 of class. Uh, Today's topic focuses on the achievement gap and the need to look beyond the um, surface when we think about what constitutes the achievement gap. It will come in the form of a lecturette, which means that it will be a condensed lecture than the typical one that I would normally give. And I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons because I got some feedback from students saying that my first lecture was just a bit too long. And so I'm going to try to keep this one a little more condensed so that folks can kind of come in, take what they need and finish up and wrap up with this class. Really, the important part that I want you to get is just kind of the big takeaways. So let's kind of go with the big takeaways. We'll start there. And what I really want you to achieve or kind of get out of this class or this week's class. So the major takeaways that I think we should be covering is that all the readings in some way, shape, or form are trying to get us to change the metaphor. When we think about this issue of a change of a achievement gap, if we change the metaphor, then we really profoundly change the meaning of what we mean with achievement gap, because the idea that achievement gap focuses or reifies this deficit thinking is prevalent in pretty much all of the readings across the board. And so if you look at Gloria Ladson-Billings' article, she prefers this term education debt. Milner uses the word or the phrase opportunity gap. Terabins' Chambers reading kind of is asking us to think about changing the phrase to receivement gap. And the Barnett Lamy article is getting us to think about the socioeconomic gap. So at least 4 of the 5 readings for next week, or this week rather, really are encouraging us to think about the possibilities that come to us or that are afforded to us when we change the metaphor and we start moving away from this issue of the achievement gap. And when we change the metaphor, then we really think about or provide us, it opens up a space rather for us to think about other things that are impacting or affecting student outcomes. And these in many ways, and you all are familiar with some of these, is that these are deeply ingrained structural elements that reproduce these social inequities, or at the very least are contributing to some of these societal inequities that we see in schools that contribute to these achievement gaps to begin with. And so the idea is that the problem is not really the students per se, or necessarily the problem. It's not found in students. The problem is found in bigger structures that contribute to the student outcomes that we're seeing when we test students and try to think about that and what contributes to these student outcomes. So if you look at the Gloria Ladson-Billings article, like I said before, she really starts off by really probing this economics metaphor. She kind of says that she's going to go down this rabbit hole using this metaphor of kind of pursuing the rabbit hole and using the metaphor of economics. She suggests that there's at least 2 very different ways that economics literature helps us understand things. And so they either help us understand things in terms of deficits, which is kind of the debt that you accumulate in one particular fiscal year, or this notion of debt, in which is the deficits that are accumulated over time. And so what she's suggesting in her particular reading is that we do have some sort of education debt, and this education debt, particularly with 2 kids of color, has been built over time since the beginning of this country. There's you add to that this kind of socio-political debt, this debt that's not just social but kind of politically informed, politically motivated and influenced, coupled with this kind of moral debt that we don't really these kids have been kind of seen in the eyes of the larger society as kind of throwaway kids, and you have this confluence of ideology that has led to or produced this education debt. over time, and you see that manifested in kind of the different kinds of outcomes that we're seeing in schools today. And so Gloria Ladson-Billings is kind of pushing us in her presidential speech to the American Educational Research Association not to think about the issue of the achievement gap, which is focusing on, again, this idea that this gap is produced somehow magically, but that, you know, that this is a gap that's been accumulated through time. It's a gap that's really embedded or grounded in this bigger education debt. And we have an education debt to kids of color, poor white kids, et cetera. And I think that her work, I think, is probably one of the foundational pieces that many of the other pieces have referenced, because, you know, Gloria Ladson-Billings, as just kind of one of the foremothers in this particular area, has really kind of pushed this idea of thinking beyond the surface, thinking beyond what we see on the surface in terms of educational gaps, in terms of achievement gaps that we're seeing. And so really pushing the field to think beyond the surface level and really digging deeper into what some of these other issues are that might be influencing what we see on the surface, and, you know, with respect to test scores, achievement, behavior, et cetera. Rich Milner takes up that idea of the education debt and kind of builds on that and really tackles this idea of the standardized test scores, and begins to challenge what we mean by, you know, what the standardized test score really is doing. You know, kids are not standardized in the same way. Therefore, we can't really use a standardized measure or standardized rubric to compare children. It just doesn't make sense. The idea is that if we think about you know, this idea that kids come with a whole variety of backgrounds, a variety of differences, et cetera, then we should be kind of honoring that in the classroom. And so, you know, so one of the problems I think that Rich Milner is pointing out is that when you use this idea of the achievement gap is really positioning white kids as the norm, and every other kid is kind of deficit or different from that particular norm. And so so he's challenging us, Rich Milner's challenging us, that, you know, to really be critical of the standardized test, because what the standardized test is really measuring are a whole range of other different things, that are above, beyond, and deeper than what we're seeing on the surface. Again, you know, that these really are instructional gaps, they're learning gaps, they're gaps in teacher quality, teacher training, the curriculum gaps, access to technology. They're rooted in wealth income disparities in the larger society. They're a product of unequal employment opportunities that exist in society. You know, there's food deserts. There's, you know, the schools are still segregated, and so, you know, and so there's a whole range of issues that are influencing and impacting the test score, and we need to kind of figure out what to do about those issues as a society, rather than really focusing on the achievement that kids are producing in schools as the sole arbiter of student success. And so again, you know, Rich Milner building off the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings and really thinking about what does this mean to take this up? How do we challenge ourselves in our field to look beyond the surface? And again, I think that both the Rich Milner and the Gloria Ladson-Billings pieces are pretty powerful in that regard, to kind of think beyond the surface. What Rich Milner does is that he highlights this framework for us to think about these mindsets or practices that are based in schools that some educators have that produce these opportunity gaps. Some of these are color blindness. They're, you know, we don't see this idea that we don't see color, that we see kids. You hear that it's a very prevalent logic in schools, and basically what we're in effect saying is that we don't see your difference. We don't recognize you. We don't validate you. We don't value your difference and what you bring to society and what you bring to this classroom. And so it's an erasure of the self. It's an erasure of identity. And so when you move towards a colorblind achievement philosophy, it really does a lot more harm than good, especially for kids of color. The other idea is this idea that we have lots of cultural conflicts in the curriculum, cultural conflicts in how we engage with kids, especially kids who are different than ourselves. This idea that we're not engaging in culturally responsive practices. When there's that conflict there, it's imperative on schools to really kind of breach or kind of figure out how to work across this difference, this cultural difference. And oftentimes we don't. We expect the assimilation to happen. We expect students and parents to assimilate into the school structure, and by doing that, then we're inadvertently kind of contributing to these opportunity gaps as well as a school structure. This idea that this myth of meritocracy, this idea that everybody kind of has an equal chance, that everybody starts in this race towards achievement in the same space, and if everybody kind of starts there, you can achieve it if you just work hard enough, pull yourself from the bootstraps, give it some effort, and we'll all you can achieve and you can do great things. And while in theory and in spirit, that's a great kind of mindset. You never want to embrace or think about the kids are deficient. The idea is that if you don't understand that there's that context is important, that the kid's background is important, then you're really kind of embracing this idea that we live in a context neutral society, which is the final point here. But which is connected to then the fifth point about deficit thinking, right? That if the context is neutral and you believe in meritocracy, then kids who don't achieve that, something must be wrong with them. Something has to be there. These kids are broken. These families are broken, etc. And then you adopt or move towards low expectation, low worth of these families. And so I do think that it's important for schools to think about the practices that we have, these kinds of routinized mindsets that we kind of go through in and day out, and how those kind of contributing to these opportunity gaps that Rich Milner talks about. I think the framework is pretty powerful, and it is something that's worth digging into and identifying ways in which the schools are contributing to these inequities each and every day. Tara Benson Chambers' piece is asking us to really be critical about the achievement gap, and what she's taking on, just like all the previous authors before her, is really taking on this idea of the achievement gap and how it focuses so much on the student as a problem. It's reproducing this kind of deficit thinking, this deficit discourse, that nothing else matters. It's kind of this decontextualized student, trying to perform, if you will, against another student. And when you decontextualize students and you're only looking at student outcomes, then it's easy to kind of look at the achievement gap as something that, to try to compare two individuals. But the problem with that logic is that it focuses on the students as being the problem and not these kinds of the context that they come from. So she's asking us to, instead of looking at achievement, which is an outcome, to really look at receivement. What are the inputs that students have? Instead of looking at outcomes, really looking at inputs, really looking at what's the context that students are bringing in with them, and how those inputs are impacted or directly connect to those outcomes. She did a study with 7 students, and which the study was really focused on tracking. But one of the unfortunate things that at least jumped out to me in this study is that one of the major findings is that the students really had this internalized negative, inferior beliefs about their ability, and these beliefs were reinforced directly by the school structures. They began to have doubts about their own ability. They began to understand how schools were structured, and how these structures really not just perpetuated these beliefs about their own abilities, but they were able to see that and say, you know, and speak truth to power. And so these are very powerful voices that were speaking, that were highlighting these inequities. Students can see this is going on, but yet at the same time, students had a lot of doubts about their own ability and their own kind of natural talents and skill sets. And these are things that have been going on through time, because they're tracking them from the time they're young to the time they're in high school, to the time they're able to articulate their stories and understand them and reflect back. These kids are really seeing that they're products of a system that has tracked them in a particular way. And I think all of us have been products, or are products of tracking. I myself was a product of tracking. I was tracked when I was in as early as second grade, I believe. I was tracked gifted talented, and at that point, from that point on, I always had the gifted talented marker following me everywhere I went. I went to the third grade, I was marked gifted talented. I went to the fourth grade, I was marked gifted talented. I went to the fifth grade, I was marked gifted talented, and so on and so forth. And so being tracked, I think, is one of the best things and one of the worst things that ever happened to me. Best thing because I was tracked in a positive way. So my teachers saw great things. I began to internalize this belief that I was superior, that I was good, that I was excellent at particular things. But yet at the same time, my friends were not. And so I was removed. Back then we had a pull-out component. And so I was pulled into a multi-age classroom. We were rewarded for our test scores. They took us to Magic Mountain and Disneyland and all sorts of treats. We were rewarded at the zoo. It was so much fun being rewarded for being quote unquote smart. But at the same time, there was a number of students that were not. There were a number of students that began to internalize the sense that they were not smart, that they couldn't do it, and that there were only a handful of kids that really were smart in their entire school. And so I think part of this is self-fulfilling behavior, that people will internalize beliefs about themselves based on others' perceptions of them. And I think it's worth exploring that component. And you see some of these self-fulfilling ideals and self-fulfilling notions in the study that Tara did. So it's a really powerful study that Dr. Benson Chambers has produced. It's worth kind of really digging into, really listening to those student voices and identifying the various ways in which kids began to internalize these perceptions about themselves based on the track that they were placed in. And so again, she's using that study as a springboard to think beyond and how these structures really are producing these particular kinds of outcomes in kids. And so her work is calling us to challenge this idea of the achievement gap, to really think about how different inputs might also be contributing to that. But at the same time, highlighting the very structures in schools that shape, produce, recreate these kinds of outcomes in kiddos. So I think that there's a two-way kind of lesson that's going on in Dr. Benson Chambers' reading that it's worth exploring, and it's very powerful stuff. So really dig deep into this particular article. This is a really strong one and a pretty powerful one that I highly recommend. We'll talk about the Barnett-Lamy article next. I honestly don't know how to pronounce that last name. We'll call her Lamy. And I will say that that this particular piece is one that I read a while back, several years ago. It's one that's been cited quite often in the literature, and it's really kind of looking at this issue of class opportunities, and how class really structure these achievement differences from very early on. And so by the time it's kind of pre-education, from the time you're in the womb to the time you start kindergarten, there are already a host of different of opportunities that are based and grounded in class that are that these structures contribute to your to student differences from very early on. And so she suggested this, or they suggest that the school readiness gap can be explained by things like family background, family characteristics, income, parent education, family structures, neighborhood conditions, etc. And so there's even things like parenting style, how parents engage with their kids, whether they play with their kids, all of that, which is kind of class-based, because you have more time, right? If you've got the time to play with your child and to really provide kind of this nurturing space and environment that fosters educational learning, that's really a manifestation of class, because the time that takes time, it takes energy, it takes effort, and many times many parents who have to work 2 or more jobs aren't there they can't afford, or they don't have the luxury, if you will, to dedicate to do that kind of structured learning and provide that space. That's not to say that their homes are different, are deficient. That's not to say that they don't love their kids, and not to say that they don't want to spend time with their kids. It just means that they don't have the same capability sets than a middle class parent who is able to afford that space, that time to their kids. And so again, I don't want to reproduce some sort of deficit thinking, and we should avoid that at all costs, but really to suggest that the capability sets that a low income parent has is very different than a middle income parent, and the middle income parent capability sets are very different than an upper SES income parent. And so and so the differences that you see between these groups are very big. And so the article itself suggests that the gap between middle income and high income is as big as the gap between low income and middle income. And so there's something to be said about class structuring these opportunities to be school ready, if you will. And so they suggest, Barnett and Laney suggest, that one of the solutions is to provide high quality preschool, especially for low SES students. That might be a vehicle, might be a way to at least offset the differences that we're seeing in early childhood outcomes and school readiness outcomes, especially with low SES kiddos. The last article that I want to talk about is the Osterman article. And that Osterman article kind of came from left field. It was really weird because it just seemed like it didn't really connect with the other readings. Because Osterman was really talking about this idea of community, but I want us to think about what the connection might be. And so the connection that I see with this particular piece, and the reason why I had to read Osterman's work, is that in Osterman's text, which is kind of a broad lit review, if you will, is suggesting that community really is the foundation of educational success. And it's really kind of connecting this, although she doesn't really mention Maslow's hierarchy needs, it really is almost kind of parallel to Maslow's hierarchy, such that if you meet these kind of basal needs, these individual needs, or what she calls basic needs in her text, that's going to lead to if you're in a community that is meeting your basic fundamental needs, relational needs, then it's going to impact motivation. It's going to impact your sense of security. It's going to impact your sense of well-being. And ultimately, it's going to impact things like school performance, right? And so, again, this idea that we need to not just foster healthy communities outside the school, but we need to foster healthy communities inside the school. We need to model good communities in school because those are also contributing to a student sense of belonging, a student sense of membership in school, a student sense of support, and ultimately, this idea of well-being and success. And so so again, it's highlighting that this idea that community, not just kind of the external community, but the internal community as well, is something that that is providing some sort of psychological fulfillment that is important for all kids' psycho-emotional development, and that really is the key. And how much of that is or is not found in schools and outside of schools. Again, if you're coming from communities that might have an enormous amount of community strengths, but those community strengths are not built or not capitalized on, then we're missing a golden opportunity for us to really recognize how community is strengthening and plays a role in structuring students' development. And so it reminds me of the work of the funds of knowledge that was done many years ago on how schools need to really think about and learn from communities to the point where they can take teachers, get them out into the community, learn from the community, learn the strengths of the community, bring those back into the school, and then model community and model the community that's found outside of the community inside the school. And once you kind of have those strengths, once you have these funds of knowledge and you're functioning from a strengths perspective, then you really can provide that basal, you can meet those basal needs of students so that they can be more successful in schools and think about how that contributes, if you will, to reducing this thing that we call the achievement gap. And so in the end, the important thing, the important takeaway is that we need to look beyond this idea of the achievement gap, that there are real kind of deep structures that are found outside the school that impact what happens inside the schools, and those structural pieces really are foundational to kind of reproducing a lot of the inequities that we're seeing when you're just comparing test scores. And so the second major takeaway is that what we're seeing on the surface, whether it's students who are acting out, test scores, achievement, anything that we're kind of seeing on the surface behavior, it's probably a manifestation of something deeper, of some sort of kind of deeper inequities that are found in society. But sometimes these inequities are also found in schools. They're also found in ways, in practices that we reproduce ourselves in school, like Tara Vincent Chambers' piece is reminding us about. And so, the third big takeaway, as I mentioned in the very beginning, if we change the metaphor, if we move away from this idea that achievement is only based on test scores, if we move away from this idea that achievement is kind of some sort of individual thing, but achievement really is a manifestation of something bigger, then we change our understanding of this concept of achievement gap. And so the readings for this week really provided us with a variety of different ways to rethink, re-examine, reevaluate this idea of the achievement gap, to think about a different using different metaphors, from education debt to receivement gap to opportunity gaps, whatever we might call it, however we might think about it. The important piece is that we're moving away from it so that we can rethink, reassess, and redo schools and transform schools into spaces that are focused on student well-being at its core. So that's the lecture for this week. I hope you enjoyed the readings. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Take care, and we'll see you all next time.